Welcome to today's Global Connections television program. I'm Bill Miller. The main purpose of this show is to promote a discussion of major international issues such as war and peace, economic and social development, climate change, and human rights that impact people worldwide. New knowledge will inspire, involve, and motivate all of us to better deal with these challenges and to help create a better world. Today's program is going to focus upon a United Nations agency, the International Labor Organization, and some of the issues it's dealing with, especially in the areas of employment and unemployment and employment opportunities. We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at the United Nations International Labor Organization and some of the work that it's doing in the areas of identifying future employment trends, dealing with unemployment, and also looking at employment opportunities. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Moazam Mahmood. Mr. Moazam Mahmood is the director of the International Labor Organization's Research Department. His professional interests are macro policy and growth and employment. Mr. Moazam Mahmood, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into your department in just a moment, but let's talk a little bit about the International Labor Organization. As I recall, it's the third oldest of the United Nations agencies. It was formed in 1919. What was the main purpose of the International Labor Organization? What is your main goal today?
Well, Bill, it's a bit difficult to generalize across such an old and historic organization and attribute to it one mission. But if I were to take a crack at it, as others have done before me, I would say social justice. Because I won't say if you recall, but if we recall from our history books, that was a time when Europe had been torn apart, not just by conflict, but also military conflict, but also social conflict. And therefore the ILO, or this entity, was seen as coming to the aid of working people and giving them a better lot in life, especially in the troubled time that it was in Europe and across the Atlantic, and indeed across a lot of the what was then the colonized world and the colonial world, and to try and see if the lot of the working people could be improved compared to all the huge tendencies towards monopolies, towards worsening working conditions. We were just coming out of the second industrial revolution, and therefore it was felt very important that there be more even-handedness between capital on one side and labor on the other side.
And our viewers can go to www.ilo.org and get more information about what we're talking about today and learn more about the International Labor Organization. ILO is a very unique agency for many reasons. One of them is because it has a tripartite system. What exactly is this tripartite system, and why is it so unique?
Well, Bill, it is very unique because if you think about it, most organizations have a governing body or a set of constituents which are largely governments and or other entities of the same kind. Now, the ILO has constituents from three bodies. One, yes, governments, but because we are the ILO, the labor organization, so we have workers on our governing body, and to balance that out, we have an equal number of employers on our governing body. Now that is the whole point of social justice, to try and underpin the move towards social justice with a dialogue across three sets of players, the workers whose rights need to be respected and furthered, employers who play a role in that relationship as employers of workers, and of course governments, because we live in a world, in an arena where there are nation states, and they have to enact policies which the ILO recommends and has conventions on. Therefore, with these three constituents, we feel we have a very broad social base to try and deliver such a huge social goal as justice, social justice.
And with the three parts, the tripartite arrangement, it's like a three-legged stool. You have to have all three parts for the stool to be effective. You pull one away, you take the labor out, the stool collapses, or you take the employers out, the stool collapses.
Precisely. So you have, in the economic term, equilibrium, or we attempt to move towards that, and we attempt to base our social policy on such a broad base. That is the idea. And of course, the ILO, as you will be familiar and our readers should be familiar with, is that the ILO moves foremost on rights, and the rights for in the world of work. And of course, these have to do with freedoms, so freedoms of association, collective bargaining, so those are sort of much more legislative rights. These have to do also with economics. So clearly, if you have collective bargaining, then that strengthens wages, or the relationship between wages and how much workers produce, so between wages and productivity. And then of course there are rights about fundamental safety issues, and in this day and age when you hear so much about huge massive industrial accidents in mines, in ungoverned workplaces, then occupational safety and health becomes a huge issue. As our Director General was always pointing out, that there are probably more people killed through industrial accidents than through a large number of conflicts that you hear about. So if you like, it's an abiding issue. While we see physical and military conflict, but the issue of loss of life and limb in the workplace is a terribly, terribly important one. And then if you think about how much it affects working families with the loss of life and limb, it's huge. So our recommendations, our conventions are meant to be both for freedoms, but also for economic rights and social rights.
And the rights you were talking about a minute ago, do they tie into the decent work agenda that has been so prominently on the front burner, really, of the ILO for the past couple of years? Is that a large part of it?
Well, the term decent work was meant to capture in one sound bite this huge agenda of social justice. And while the ILO works in so many areas on rights, on employment, on social protection, on dialogue, and it traverses, as you can imagine, a large number of technical and social issues, but therefore decent work was conceptualized as a way to capture the essence of that and to be able to convey to people around the world the notion that what the world seeks, what the working world seeks, and what the ILO seeks, strives to deliver for the world of work is the notion of decent work.
Now, you're the director of the ILO Research Department. What is that department? What's its main function? What do you do?
Well, Bill, research is, maybe our concept of research is girls and boys in white lab coats hidden in the back of the factory.
That's part of it.
What we intend, of course, research is undertaken in all the departments of the ILO. The idea that this Director General had in forming a research department was to bring more gravitas, more concentration of firepower to bear on the area of showing and demonstrating that policies, social policies, policies for social justice make sense not just for rights but also make economic sense for the world. If I could give you an example, we say that wages and a decent wage is not just good for the individual, which it obviously is, for the household, which we call the micro level, it's also good for the economy at the macro level, because it allows people to earn a minimum wage. So it puts a floor under the household, but it also allows, aggregated across all workers, it puts a floor under the economy. And if you were not to have that, then demand would fall, purchasing power would fall, and therefore the economy winds its way down, rather than if you have a minimum wage and a structure like that, the economy can be headed up in an upward spiral rather than a downward spiral. So the job of the research department is to consistently bring to bear what we call empirical regularities in the world of work, that wages work in a particular way, productivity works in a particular way, that things work well together if wages and productivity track each other rather than if they don't. If wages fall too far behind productivity, then you will not have social justice, and it will not make sense for either the individual or for the economy, because if productivity is shooting too far ahead, wages are lagging behind, then you get a disproportionality between wages and profits, and then the income distribution runs into trouble. So the job of the research department is to try and underpin policy with good analytics and empirical evidence.
You mentioned about the wage providing a floor, and that really helped the worker, helped the family, helped the economy in total. There are many economic studies that have been done over the years that support the idea that really, if you look at we'll take the United States for example. Sure. We're sitting here right now, but if you look back in the 20s and what have you, the early 30s, the U.S. was really sort of run by a bunch of robber barons, capitalists who just exploited. And there's a strong argument that labor unions that started to come online in the 20s, 30s, and 40s really were the underpinning as far as helping to gain these workers' rights, to get a decent income, to get a 40-hour work week, to get health insurance, to get retirement, to get vacation time, those types of things that really helped to create a vibrant middle class in the United States. And it's not just true for the U.S. We'll just say this is a prototype. It's true in some other countries too. But the unions have played a very critical role. But we see today that unions are being hollowed out. They're being fought in many different directions. Their membership has been reduced quite often. But how important is it to have vibrant unions in a society to talk about the issues we're talking about and to help create this vibrant middle class, and not have a society where everybody fends for him or herself and it's a race to the bottom to see who can do the work more cheaply than the person next to you?
Well, Bill, you've made the case better than I could. You have demonstrated
I'm going to rely on you, your expertise.
Not at all, but you've got the essential argument, which is that you do need a collective body which is better than the individual in order to give workers bargaining power. And you agree, this world in the marketplace, it's all about bargaining power, whether it's on one side or the other side. And you do very much, unions are the formal institution in the last two, possibly if you go back to the syndicalists, the last 3 centuries, whereby unions or their earlier predecessors, the syndicates of artisans and workers, etc., could bargain on behalf of a collective body rather than the individual, because clearly the collective is a bit stronger. And therefore, yes, in order to get social justice, in order to get more bargaining power for workers, they have been indispensable. Now, the issue of wages, we keep circling back to that because, quite frankly, it is one of the critical variables which is very, very important. And we are sitting in the US. Let's take an example from here, because the argument is always given from some sides. As an economist, I always say, let's look at both arguments. So on the one hand, we say wages are terribly important because they put a floor under the individual, the household, the economy, and the minimum wage or a wage structure. But then there is a counter argument in economics, and I am an economist, to say that yes, but you can cost out, make jobs too expensive. So then you have various technical academic papers which show that, oh, if you raise the wage sufficiently, you will lose demand. It will become too expensive. Yes, that is so. But again, as in the research department, our job is to look at all these studies, do surveys, do studies of our own. One of the examples comes from New York, when restaurant workers attempted to put in a minimum wage across, is it the Hudson, across in Jersey, and everybody said that you will raise the minimum wage and therefore you will cost out and you will cause unemployment amongst waiters and waitresses. But you had a comparative across the river in Manhattan and across in New Jersey, and that was found not to be the case. So, okay, that's one example. But we have more and more evidence that a responsible productivity link increased in the wage can certainly help and not reduce demand and not cause unemployment and not cause jobs to go offshore. But equally, you can also have, you have to be clearly, again, I go back to the relationship, wages and productivity have to be linked together. So let's take it that way.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately financed, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Our viewers are invited to check out the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous shows. If you're interested in distributing our shows through PBS, Community Access Television, educational institutions, a website, or any other media outlets, please go to our website for more information. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service at no cost. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations International Labor Organization and some of the work that it's doing as far as identifying employment trends, employment opportunities, and the workforce of the future. My guest today is an expert on the International Labor Organization. My guest today is Mr. Moazam Mahmood, who is the director of the ILO's Research Department. We're going to move to your department now. We've worked our way up to it. You do a variety of studies. You mentioned you're an economist and you folks look at a wide range of things. What have you done recently to focus on employment trends, unemployment of youth, unemployment for women, those types of things? That's a large order, but very briefly, do you have recent studies and what are some of your recommendations to help deal with those particular challenges?
Yes, Bill. The research department is oriented completely towards outputs, we are not about process, we're not about meetings, we're much more about producing the ILO's two main annual flagships. This is called the World Employment and Social Outlook, and the World Employment and Social Outlook Trends comes out in January of each year, where we benchmark the labor market, which is designed precisely to answer the question that you were asking, across the 170 to 180 odd countries that we cover, for which we have nationally provided data. So we use data provided by national government sources, we make it comparable, and we benchmark the labor market, which means we say that at the moment global unemployment is 6.4%. That global unemployment prior to the crisis, which is the current global recession, which has been running from 2008 to now, and things are not great now, but unemployment, global unemployment has risen by about 0.5%. If you want me to give it to you in terms of numbers or jobs lost, which is easier to relate, then between 2007 and 2015, when we issued our January World Employment and Social Outlook Trends report, the number of jobs lost was approximately 29 million. If you want me to give a broader figure, I would say about 30 million jobs lost. Now, that's just registered unemployment. If we take into account discouraged workers, that is, workers who are too discouraged to bother to register for work. And the US again is a prime example, because what happens is that the labor force participation rate, the proportion of people of working age who are actually working or registered, in the US, that is reckoned during this crisis to have dropped by close to 3%, which means that if we consider that globally, we can add to the 29-30 million a similar number of discouraged workers. So actually, the number of jobs lost is closer to 60 million in this last 7-8 years. So those are the kinds of numbers that we look at. And of course, we do it by looking at gender decompositions. Now, let me give you an example of the second report that we do, which is we've got the WESO trends, which comes in January. And then before our International Labour Conference, which comes in June, we come up with a report which is more thematic. So it's a WESO thematic. And currently, the report we are producing is going to be on poverty. So jobs to end poverty. And that is related to the social development goals which have just come under the UN. And that is a report which is based on trying to link. Our Director General wanted us to think more systematically about the social development goals. And in order to help the House move in that direction, we thought we would link Goal 1, which is reduction of poverty or end of poverty, to Goal 8, which is something that the ILO stands behind very strongly, which is full and productive employment and decent work for all. So our current report, WESO, on jobs to end poverty or transforming jobs to end poverty, looks at that relationship, that yes, we are familiar with the aphorism that the only sustainable route out of poverty has to be through jobs. No other economy can afford that, but any other answer. But we are trying to look precisely at the empirical relationship between jobs and poverty. The jobs that the poor have compared to the jobs that the non-poor have, and its impact on poverty.
And connecting goal number 1 and goal number 8, I believe you mentioned, do you come up with recommendations on how those two can be combined? What can be done from the macro standpoint? What can be done by governments, by private sector business operations, by non-governmental organizations, educational institutions, anybody that can be a player as far as helping to create those employment opportunities and to eliminate poverty, as you said, referring back to goal number 1. Do you come up with specific recommendations on how that can happen? Or do you have, if it's not in the report, do you have some today?
Well, the report is still to come. And the Director General has to review the report and release it on, I believe it is coming out on the 18th of May, after which I'll be happy to come and give you all the details of the report. But at the moment, in the general spirit, what we are attempting to do is to point out what kinds of work the poor have compared to the non-poor, and how does it vary. What are the jobs, for example, the poor tend to have more vulnerable jobs compared to the non-poor. For example, the poor tend to have a lot of unpaid female labor. Now that's a very important gender dimension. So from the point of view of the labor market, we're looking at that, but then we also look at it from the macro point of view, which is what sort of policies promote growth that produce jobs. Because you can also have job poor growth or job weak growth. And therefore, we are looking at ways in which economies produce more jobs rather than less jobs, and what sort of sectoral development helps that. And we again are behind the idea that you have to have what we call productive transformation, which is, it is not enough to just have very high growth. You've got to have qualitative changes in growth. which is moving from low productivity sectors to higher productivity
Well,
sectors.
Mr. Moazam Mahmood, my mistake. You have really covered a wide range of issues today, dealing with the problems we're facing today and what we will be dealing with in the future. And of course, our viewers can go to www.ilo.org to get much more information about this, and to look at your report after May and take a look at it, and also to focus on how we can all participate in helping to overcome these problems, because it is a challenge in the future, and not only in the future but today. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you, Will.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. Please join us again for the next episode of Global Connections Television. I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for watching.